Right now, Starlink satellites circle the globe, over 7,000 of them active as of mid-2025, delivering internet to locations once considered unreachable. We'll cover what Starlink can do today, where it's proven useful, and the controversy it still sparks worldwide. Yet each new launch raises pressing questions. How do nations regulate a sky they don't control? How do astronomers study the universe with these satellites sweeping across their telescopes? And perhaps most intriguingly, who gains the most when a private company holds this much influence over global connectivity? To understand those questions, we first need to look at the scale Starlink has already reached. From vision to scale, the numbers of 2025. Look up on a clear night, and the small streaks you might see sliding across the sky are no longer rare. By mid-2025, more than 7,300 active Starlink satellites orbit the Earth, circling in layered shells that form the largest communications system humanity has ever launched. What began in 2019 with only a few dozen satellites has scaled into a network that now represents over 60% of all operational spacecraft in low Earth orbit. No other company in history has claimed such a dominant share of orbital infrastructure, and that dominance carries weight far beyond the numbers themselves. The raw scale matters because each unit in this constellation supports actual internet users on the ground. As of mid-2025, Starlink reports around 6 million subscribers worldwide. For families in rural Chile or students in remote Navajo Nation classrooms, the service delivers between 50 and 150 megabits per second, a speed that was unthinkable in those places just a few years ago. In practice, this makes the network comparable to a permanent overhead internet backbone, only one that is privately owned and expanding month by month. Scale, however, comes with consequences. Because so many satellites belong to one network, astronomers face regular interference as reflective trails cut across their instruments, and regulators worry about the growing risk of orbital congestion. The satellites also carry clear strategic implications. Their resilience and wide reach make them an attractive tool in times of conflict, drawing attention from defense planners as well as civilian users. These debates show that Starlink isn't just another telecom company. It is reshaping norms for both space science and global security. What the figures from 2025 reveal is not only rapid expansion, but also a structural shift. Low Earth orbit, once dominated by national weather, GPS, and research satellites, now functions as a layer of commercial internet infrastructure. The influence of that shift is visible on the ground in everyday life, yet it also raises unresolved questions about space governance, equity, and dependence on a single private provider. And while expansion has already transformed the orbital landscape, the more challenging question is what that reach actually means for people still waiting at the edges of today's internet map. The digital divide. Has Starlink closed the gap? The question is not whether satellites are overhead, but whether their presence has meaning for the people who still lack dependable access. This is where the idea of the digital divide comes into sharp focus. Has Starlink truly helped close it, or has it only narrowed the gap in very specific places while leaving larger obstacles untouched? Evidence in 2025 points to a mixed reality. Certain communities have seen immediate impacts, while vast regions remain excluded for reasons tied more to cost and local policy than to coverage. On the Navajo Nation in the American Southwest, for instance, Starlink terminals placed in scattered schools brought broadband into classrooms where dial-up had been the only option. Teachers cited higher attendance and improved assignment completion once video conferencing became possible. In Mist, Oregon, households that once relied on unstable DSL connections now report stable service sufficient for both remote work and online classes. These outcomes are real and measurable. Similar patterns have emerged abroad. In Sotomo, Chile, a fishing village reachable only by boat Families who once waited days to send or receive mail now participate in online marketplaces and video calls. Clinics there have begun to coordinate telemedicine sessions with doctors hundreds of miles away. The change is not abstract. Patient wait times have dropped, and parents say consultations that once meant multi-day trips can now happen the same afternoon. For a place at the edge of the map, this is a leap. Outside routine community use, emergency response has added another dimension. After storms or wildfires disrupt local networks, aid teams in 2024 often carried Starlink as part of their kit. In coastal Philippines, terminals deployed in evacuation centers allowed families to reconnect with relatives abroad within hours of a typhoon. Relief coordinators uploaded supply maps to partner agencies in real time. In Greece, firefighters used satellite-powered hotspots in mountain villages to keep evacuation orders flowing when cell towers failed. In these contexts, connectivity becomes more than convenience. It becomes infrastructure for survival. Agricultural and rural economies offer further examples. In Western Kenya, farming cooperatives use Starlink to access up-to-date weather data, reducing crop loss during sudden shifts in rainfall. A cooperative in one pilot program reported higher yields and better bargaining power because they coordinated sales directly with regional markets. Along Alaskan coasts, fishing crews onboard small vessels now monitor shipping traffic from the sea rather than waiting until harbor arrival. In each case, the immediate outcome is practical: more predictable farming revenue, safer navigation, and increased participation in regional markets. These cases show the promise, but the broader global picture quickly reminds us of the limits. Though coverage spans most latitudes, affordability and regulation often stand in the way. In North America or Europe, a subscription costing around $120 per month is within reach for rural households who treat it as a utility. But in much of sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, that same figure can represent a significant portion of household income. Even with regional discounts, some subsidized plans in African markets reduce costs to around $30.50. Terminals and monthly fees remain significant hurdles. In fact, in parts of East Africa, the upfront cost of a terminal can equal several months' wages, and ongoing fees consume a substantial share of earnings. For many families, these economics mean the technology is visible but not attainable. Cooperative workarounds appear wherever individual access is unrealistic. In Tanzanian villages, groups of families pool funds to share a community terminal placed in one central spot. Similar patterns exist in Nepal and parts of Pakistan, where roadside Starlink-powered internet cafes provide access for a fee. These arrangements extend some benefits, but they also reinforce inequalities. Students or workers living closer to the community hub gain far more than those in surrounding hills or more distant homesteads. SpaceX has experimented with flexible pricing to address this. Community Wi-Fi stations, where one terminal broadcasts access to a wider public, have rolled out in select African markets, and mini packages offering lower speeds at reduced costs were introduced in 2024. Still, these remain pilot offerings with limited reach. Pricing structures may narrow the gap in certain regions, but they are not yet universal solutions. Here, the divide is less about whether a satellite is overhead, and more about whether households can pay for sustained, reliable use of that link. The uneven distribution of access produces layered consequences. In education, one rural school might leap forward when Starlink arrives, while the next valley school remains locked out and drifts further behind. Economically, connected towns begin selling online or coordinating healthcare digitally, while neighboring communities remain cut off. Governments recognize this disparity, and their reactions vary. Some, like Chile or Mexico, encourage deployment as a way to leapfrog traditional infrastructure investment. Others remain wary, raising concerns about dependence on a foreign company for critical connectivity and worrying about sovereignty should political conflicts arise. Studies of service introduction in rural regions confirm meaningful changes where terminals are adopted. Households report savings by switching to internet-based phone calls instead of expensive long-distance charges. Doctors in isolated clinics conduct hundreds of telehealth consultations that previously required in-person travel to regional hospitals. Local entrepreneurs, especially women in small villages, use online platforms to sell crafts or foods to nearby towns. These are quantifiable improvements. Income rises, healthcare becomes more available, and family connections strengthen. Yet the scale of these outcomes cannot obscure the broader reality. Hundreds of millions, and likely over 1 billion, people remain effectively offline in 2025. For them, costs, language barriers, digital literacy, and political restrictions are larger obstacles than satellite coverage itself. Starlink has succeeded in punching through physical barriers of oceans and mountains, but human barriers remain firmly in place. Income inequality ensures that the same monthly fee is trivial for a Colorado rancher, but impossible for a Malawian farmer. National policies in China or Iran restrict foreign-controlled networks altogether. In these places, the availability of a signal does not equate to access. Framed this way, the digital divide is not a binary story of connected versus unconnected. Instead, it resembles a spectrum where service can be transformative for some but unattainable for many. Starlink narrows gaps in certain contexts: classrooms on the Navajo Nation, clinics in Sotomo, farms in rural Kenya, but it does not erase them. For every success, there remain families that watch from the outside, aware of the possibilities but unable to participate. By mid-2025, Starlink stands as the most advanced private attempt to reduce global digital isolation. Its pace of deployment far surpasses similar projects that collapsed in the past, and in many specific places, the difference is life-changing. Yet its reach highlights a kind of dual reality. Progress is undeniable, but exclusion persists. Economic inequality and regulatory resistance prevent universal outcomes. In practice, the divide has narrowed for some but remains vast for others. And the story does not stop with household or classroom access. The true test of satellites often comes when conditions on the ground fail altogether, when floods, fires, conflicts, or censorship erase normal networks overnight. In those moments, connectivity is measured not in monthly plans or terminal sales, but in whether people can find a line out of crisis. Connectivity in crisis, Starlink and global events. In moments when ordinary communication networks collapse, Starlink now plays a role that is difficult to ignore. In disasters, it is often a lifeline, while in conflicts and political crises, it becomes a source of contention. Across recent years, events on nearly every continent have shown how satellites moving silently above the planet can determine whether communities remain connected when the ground beneath them is broken, flooded, or deliberately silenced. The pattern is clear in Europe. During the wildfires that scorched rural Greece in 2024, entire stretches of mobile towers and fiber lines burned away. Starlink terminals mounted on emergency trucks supplied the only stable links, letting fire commanders upload aerial images and coordinate evacuations as flames cut across highways. In those villages, evacuation routes were drawn and lives moved faster to safety because the satellites could carry information that ground systems no longer could. Far into the Pacific, a very different disaster unfolded the same year. When a tsunami followed a major earthquake in the Solomon Islands, communication with the outside world vanished. Portable Starlink units flown in by relief groups restored links to Australia and New Zealand. Aid teams relayed supply needs, seismologists retrieved essential data, and survivors contacted distant family members in the first days after devastation. For those scattered communities, the distinction between being heard or ignored in the aftermath narrowed to whether the terminals arrived in time. Conflict has exposed another side. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Starlink has served as critical wartime infrastructure. Soldiers and civilians alike relied on the system when traditional providers faced disruption from bombardment or cyber attacks. Coordination of humanitarian corridors, medical evacuations, and even drone operations often depended on these links. Yet the dual-use nature of the network created immediate tension. While it helped sustain civilian life, governments also questioned whether control of activation and coverage by a private company gave one firm power in military theaters that even states struggle to navigate. Other crises reinforced the same lesson. In Tonga, when a submarine cable was severed by a volcanic eruption in 2022, Starlink's rapid approval offered a fallback connection to the outside world. And in the Philippines, where typhoons batter coastlines year after year, terminals deployed by NGOs have become part of the standard disaster response toolkit, keeping shelters connected when entire provinces experience blackouts. Each episode illustrates the same principle with regional variations. Satellites overhead often compress the gap between destruction and response. Yet inserting the technology into emergency zones is never without obstacles. In some countries, local law requires that terminal activation be pre-approved or restricted by geofencing. In South Africa, disputes over spectrum allocation slowed licensing. In Brazil, tensions escalated between regulators and the Musk-owned social platform X, raising questions about whether sanctions might extend to hardware approvals. These political and legal frictions matter, because when storms or conflicts strike, delays of even a few days in granting permissions can determine whether connectivity actually reaches the field. Authoritarian governments have used more direct methods of control. In parts of South Asia during mass protests, leaders ordered internet shutdowns to block organizing. Some activists smuggled in satellite terminals and managed to post footage bypassing local censors, revealing evidence of clashes that official outlets denied. Governments attempted localized jamming of signals, but Starlink's use of frequency agility and satellite-to-satellite laser routing made blocking more difficult than cutting a fiber line or shutting a cell tower. Still, more difficult is not the same as impossible. Analysts caution that determined states could invest in sustained jamming or local enforcement, limiting the absolute reach of the system even when terminals are present on the ground. This mix of promise and limitation underscores the dual role of orbital internet in emergencies. Where it arrives quickly and operates without restriction, it can mean faster rescues, more effective medical care, and family contact at a time of trauma. Where politics, regulations, or conflict interference intervene, coverage becomes fragmented. Aid groups have noted cases in which equipment was confiscated by armed groups or shut down by authorities, turning potential lifelines into contested assets. The result is a landscape where survivability and information flow increasingly depend not only on satellite capacity, but also on diplomatic agreements and local power struggles. The same tension is visible in every recent category of crisis. Hurricanes along the American Gulf Coast in 2024 again knocked down terrestrial grids, but shelter operators who had pre-positioned Starlink terminals mapped flooded neighborhoods and forwarded lists of missing persons within hours. Meanwhile, in parts of the Middle East, communities sought to use hidden terminals during government blackouts, only to face confiscations and arrests. That contrast, lifesaver in one country, banned technology in another, shows how a single infrastructure can carry opposite meanings depending on political context. For emergency responders, the conclusion is becoming inescapable. Satellites are no longer supplementary, they are becoming critical infrastructure. But that truth leads to an unavoidable complication. When one company supplies the overwhelming majority of those links, the reliability of crisis response is tied not only to physics and engineering, but to corporate decisions and international politics. Some governments continue to call for international agreements that would guarantee humanitarian corridors of connectivity regardless of local disputes. Others insist that national sovereignty over orbital access should take priority. Neither side has yet settled the balance. What emerges from these case studies is not a binary story of success or failure, but a spectrum in which utility, control, and risk all coexist. In Greece or the Solomon Islands, terminals became rescue tools. In Ukraine, they helped defend a nation but sparked fierce questions about accountability. In Tonga, they symbolized resilience. And in South Asia or the Middle East, they highlighted defiance of state censorship. The unifying thread is that satellites once treated as optional technical marvels now hold the power to define the shape of crisis response. Sometimes welcomed, sometimes suppressed, but rarely irrelevant. This transformation leaves a larger issue unresolved. If orbital internet can decide the pace of evacuation, the integrity of relief, or the visibility of protests, control of the network itself carries weight well beyond emergency planning. What happens when decisions about who connects and who does not are set not by governments or international organizations, but by a single private actor with global reach? That question is becoming more pressing as satellites move from support tools into the backbone of emergency infrastructure. And it is the very question states are beginning to confront in 2025. The geopolitical battleground. What emerges from that uncertainty is the broader recognition that Starlink is not just technology. It is now part of global politics. Governments in 2025 are reckoning with a reality where control of communication infrastructure sits in the hands of a private company, one that can extend or restrict connectivity far beyond any single nation's borders. This shifting balance places Starlink at the center of what could fairly be called a geopolitical battleground. Some governments have met this challenge with caution. Brazil offers a clear example. In 2024, regulators clashed with SpaceX over its sister platform, X, suspending Starlink's license applications as political disagreements unfolded. At the same time, nonprofit groups working deep in the Amazon urged expansion because teachers and doctors relied on terminals to connect with remote communities. The debate illustrates the tension. Genuine benefits for marginalized populations exist, but policymakers still calculate the risks of ceding too much authority to a company operating outside state oversight. India's path has been uneven as well. Initial approvals were slowed by questions about sovereignty and fears that traffic could be routed beyond domestic control. By 2025, however, the government authorized partnerships between Starlink and local giants Airtel and Jio. Those agreements gave India more influence over infrastructure deployment while still using global satellites to extend rural coverage. India's approach highlights how states attempt to bargain, allowing connectivity, but under conditions that tie systems back into familiar regulatory frameworks. Other nations have chosen restrictions over accommodation. China's position remains the sharpest example. Starlink terminals are banned, with reports of confiscations when devices cross the border. Officials see the system not as neutral infrastructure, but as a potential channel of outside influence, fundamentally incompatible with the tightly managed Great Firewall. In parallel, China is accelerating its Guoang satellite constellation, an effort to establish a domestic alternative that mirrors the Internet's global reach without surrendering informational control. In South Africa, the government also moved to suspend Starlink's operations in late 2024 over licensing violations and questions of compliance. Civil society organizations voiced concern that this cut off affordable access for rural communities already using the service. The decision underscored how quickly political disputes can cascade into connectivity outcomes at the local level. Both businesses and families found themselves entangled in a larger struggle over regulatory authority. By contrast, Western nations have often leaned into cooperation. In the United States, federal rural broadband subsidies now include Starlink contracts, helping close gaps that traditional telecoms long ignored. In Europe, disaster response agencies in places like Italy and Spain have already integrated terminals into official emergency systems. Discussions within the European Union acknowledge concerns about monopolization, yet policymakers increasingly regard Starlink as a practical necessity while calling for longer-term investment in local constellations. Western alignment is not without debate, but the pattern of acceptance is distinct. The military aspect deepens the complexity. Modern conflicts have shown that satellite internet is no longer optional support but integral infrastructure. Ukraine's reliance since 2022 proved this point. Starlink's architecture, with thousands of interlinked nodes capable of rerouting data even under attack, provides resilience unmatched by older systems. Recognition of that dual-use potential has already materialized through initiatives like Starshield, a program tailored for government and defense applications, and Space Force contracts that treat Starlink capability as directly relevant to U.S. military planning. This dual status, civilian lifeline and strategic tool, has made Starlink a more visible target. Some states have signaled that if satellites are used in wartime operations, they could be declared legitimate military objectives. For decades, satellites were associated with science, navigation, or weather tracking. Now they are tied directly to the question of who holds strategic control in orbit. Sanctions add another dimension, with U.S. policy limiting export of Starlink hardware to certain countries under national security rules. Measures like these blur the line between consumer technology and sensitive defense infrastructure. At its core, the debate reduces to one tension. Starlink provides rapid public benefit, but it also raises questions about sovereignty and strategic dependency. In practice, this plays out as states weighing whether affordable, immediate connectivity outweighs the long-term risks of foreign control. Authoritarian governments fear loss of informational control. Developing countries fear dependence and inequity. Western allies embrace the network but acknowledge the dangers of concentration in one provider. The spectrum of responses reflects how each government interprets that underlying balance differently. International diplomacy has added another layer. Forums such as the International Telecommunication Union and the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space now include debates about how to regulate or coordinate massive constellations. Nations without large budgets worry that their priorities will be sidelined if the rules are written to favor commercial giants. Liability for space debris, fair allocation of orbital slots, and prioritization of bandwidth during disasters all feature as contested issues. Even friendly governments raise quiet concerns that the scale of one firm has already surpassed what was imagined when existing treaties were drafted. That anxiety has driven alternative approaches. Some governments require local gateways to route traffic through domestic infrastructure. Others, as in India's arrangement, mandate partnerships with state-aligned telecom companies. South American regulators have raised the idea of regional licensing consortia, while African regulators in Nigeria and Kenya explore subsidy programs tied to national data protections. These policies show that while Starlink might set the pace, it does not operate unchecked. Governments are not simply accepting domination, they are negotiating, restricting, and adapting. For citizens, most of these maneuvers are invisible. What they see is whether the service loads a web page, enables video calls, or keeps telehealth sessions running after a storm. But at the policy level, every terminal is part of a much larger contest about who sets the terms of global communication. The paradox is clear. The same device that delights a rural student connecting to class triggers alarms for defense analysts worried about surveillance, command systems, or information warfare. By mid-2025, The conclusion is straightforward. Starlink is judged not just as an internet provider, but as an instrument shaping global politics. Some nations welcome it as a partner in development and disaster response. Others resist it as a threat to control. Militaries recognize its resilience as valuable yet potentially vulnerable. And diplomats increasingly treat it as an actor in space governance discussions, whether or not its owners sit at the negotiation table. This is the battleground today, a private company whose satellites drift overhead while governments compete to define their influence on the ground. The result is a world where public service, strategic leverage, and sovereignty collide in the orbit of a single network. Yet for all its weight in politics and defense, Starlink does not operate in isolation. Other constellations are beginning to rise, backed by major corporations and national partnerships that see opportunity in challenging its lead. Whether those rivals can match its scale or force, a new balance is becoming the next chapter of this story. Competition heats up, Starlink versus Kuiper and others. Starlink may lead the field by sheer numbers, but in 2025 its position is no longer uncontested. The once theoretical concept of massive satellite constellations has become a competitive race involving some of the world's largest corporations. Rivals have entered the arena with strategies that differ from SpaceX's model, each seeking to capture a share of the growing demand for global connectivity. What started as one company's head start has now become a marketplace shaped by scale, partnerships, and regulation. Amazon's Project Kuiper stands out as the most visible challenger. The first test satellites launched in 2023, followed by initial operational batches in 2024, and the expansion has been steady through 2025. While Kuiper's fleet remains far smaller than Starlink's thousands of active nodes, Amazon is not simply copying SpaceX's approach of rapid deployment. The company has built its strategy around cooperation with existing providers, mobile carriers, national broadband initiatives, and enterprise clients. Rather than selling terminals directly to households on a global scale, Kuiper is positioning itself as a partner woven into telecom frameworks. For governments hesitant to allow a foreign-controlled system to operate entirely outside their oversight, that collaborative approach can be more appealing than Starlink's independent rollout. OneWeb continues to operate in this landscape, though at a smaller scale. After bankruptcy in 2020, it re-emerged under a partnership between private investors and governments, including major backing from the UK. By 2025, its constellation provides partial coverage, but is marketed less to ordinary households and more toward institutional clients. Airlines, maritime fleets, and defense organizations use OneWeb service to maintain stable links while moving across regions where terrestrial internet cannot follow. This narrower focus limits OneWeb's growth compared to Starlink or Kuiper, but it also grants resilience because its contracts provide predictable revenue streams. The model is not mass market, but specialization has allowed OneWeb to survive. Beyond these major players, several smaller projects are pursuing different models. Some explore hybrid systems, mixing traditional geostationary satellites with low Earth orbit constellations to reduce costs, while others aim at regional coverage instead of global domination. For example, certain African and Asian initiatives propose small constellations dedicated to national or regional markets. While these do not match the scale or visibility of Starlink, they demonstrate that satellite internet has matured into a credible approach, with multiple competitors tailoring plans to their resources and political environments. For audiences comparing these efforts, three distinctions matter most. First, on coverage and scale, Starlink leads by far with more than 7,000 satellites in orbit as of mid-2025. Kuiper is still in the hundreds, ramping upward, while OneWeb remains below that range with a completed but modest deployment. This difference shows why Starlink can promise almost universal service today, something its rivals cannot yet match. Second, on business model, Starlink emphasizes direct-to-consumer growth, selling terminals directly to households and businesses. Kuiper, by contrast, bundles its service through partnerships with carriers and governments, allowing smoother integration into existing infrastructure. OneWeb narrows its focus even further, targeting airlines, maritime users, and defense contracts instead of competing directly for household subscriptions. These strategic choices show that scale alone does not define the competition. The route to users matters as much as how many satellites are aloft. Finally, pricing and regulation represent the third axis. Starlink has adopted largely uniform global pricing, which in high-income countries appears affordable, but in lower-income regions represents a heavy burden. Kuiper has signaled intent to experiment with regionally adjusted offerings, potentially bundling lower-cost access into existing telecom subscriptions. Small regional providers have also promised government-subsidized programs tied to sovereignty requirements. These pricing and policy experiments point to areas where Starlink's rivals could erode some of its dominance, not by launching more satellites first, but by aligning better with household budgets and regulatory expectations. The presence of competitors also strengthens governments' bargaining power. Regulators who hesitate to approve Starlink because of sovereignty or monopoly concerns can use the existence of Kuiper or OneWeb as leverage, demanding cooperation, localized gateways, or regional pricing concessions. Even if rivals cannot yet provide the same coverage, their availability shifts negotiations. Officials in India, Brazil, and South Africa have already referenced alternatives in regulatory discussions, showing that competition shapes not only markets, but also the political environment around global broadband. Starlink's head start is still decisive. With thousands of satellites already in service, operational experience gained year after year, and a broad subscriber base, no rival has overtaken it. But history suggests that lead positions can shift when challengers identify weaknesses. If Starlink's pricing is perceived as unaffordable in large parts of the world, Kuiper could expand with bundled, subsidized offerings. If airlines and maritime clients seek redundancy to avoid over-reliance on one provider, OneWeb can secure durable contracts. And if local governments prefer regional operators for sovereignty reasons, small constellations can still serve as meaningful alternatives. This reveals an important pattern. The competition is not about a single winner, but about different strategies colliding around the same problem, connecting people affordably and reliably from orbit. Starlink emphasizes scale. Kuiper emphasizes integration. OneWeb emphasizes specialization. Regional projects emphasize sovereignty. None alone makes the others irrelevant. Instead, the market is increasingly segmented, shaped around who can serve which need under which conditions. The long-term results remain open. Satellite broadband requires heavy capital investment and years of sustained deployment. Whether Kuiper grows fast enough to rival Starlink's coverage, or whether OneWeb can maintain stability without chasing mass adoption, will depend on choices made over this decade. What matters for now is that Starlink no longer orbits in a vacuum. Instead, the skies are filling with competition, offering governments and consumers more options than they had just a few years ago. This competition directly affects ordinary households not as a technical debate, but as a practical question of cost and access. The next issue facing potential users is straightforward. For all the service growth and satellite launches, is satellite internet actually affordable to the families and businesses who need it most? That question defines the next turn in the story. The price of connection. When people talk about satellites creating a new layer of global infrastructure, the conversation often turns quickly to a deeper issue: who can afford to use it? In 2025, the affordability of Starlink has become one of the most debated aspects of the system. The service offers genuine improvements in speed and reliability compared to earlier years, but the question that matters most to families and schools is not about megabits per second. It's about how much of a monthly budget the connection consumes. Cost is now as central to global access as the satellites themselves. In wealthier markets, the equation seems straightforward. In the United States, Canada, and much of Western Europe, the standard subscription typically ranges between $80 and $120 a month. That positions Starlink roughly within the same ballpark as cable or fiber bills. For a family on a rural farm in Minnesota, Tennessee, or Bavaria, the service feels like an extension of normal utilities, significant but reasonable, especially when it provides the only high-speed option. Equipment costs, though still notable, have been softened through financing plans or subsidies tied to rural broadband programs. For these households, Starlink is not framed as an economic burden. Instead, the debate centers on whether it is worth switching from lagging DSL or satellite TV internet, or whether fiber extensions will eventually offer better value. In lower-income markets, the same price points carry very different weight. A subscription in line with $100 per month can amount to half of what a family might spend on food in a month, or more than a week's wages in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. To address this, SpaceX has introduced regionalized pricing models. In Nigeria, for example, subsidized rates introduced in 2023 reduced monthly fees to around $30.50, paired with lower speed tiers under the mini plan. In parts of the Pacific, similar adjustments reduced upfront costs for pilot school programs. These adaptations opened access for institutions and some middle-income households, but the majority of families still find the service prohibitively expensive. Coverage overhead remains global, yet the household experience is highly uneven. To reduce strain on families, one strategy has been community sharing. Across rural South America, single terminals mounted at schools or town centers are configured as Wi-Fi access points. Villagers purchase vouchers that grant internet access for an hour, a day, or a week, similar to how prepaid phone credit spread mobile adoption in the 2000s. Shared connections also operate in parts of East Africa and South Asia, where small businesses resell bandwidth as internet cafes. While this model spreads access more broadly, it reinforces the condition that connectivity is shared and intermittent, not private and continuous. Government and donor procurement also play an important role in making connections viable. In Argentina and Peru, education ministries procured Starlink terminals for rural schools, subsidizing service so students could participate in online classes, consult digital libraries, and communicate with distant teachers. In South Africa, pilot deployments supported by development agencies linked rural clinics to hospitals in major cities, providing remote diagnostic capabilities that would otherwise have been impossible. These efforts demonstrate that affordability is not solved household by household, but through collective purchasing, where institutions can cover costs that families cannot. At the other end of the market, premium packages target corporate and high-income users. Maritime and aviation firms pay much higher rates in return for reliable, high-capacity connections across oceans and skies. For airlines, the investment makes sense. Passengers expect onboard connectivity. For shipping companies, real-time monitoring of fleet operations enhances safety and efficiency. These contracts have become important to SpaceX's revenue stream, subsidizing parts of the system's growth. Yet they also sharpen the inequality of access. A cruise passenger may stream movies over the Atlantic, while families in rural Kenya continue to pool funds for a few hours of shared connectivity each week. The discussion extends beyond simple pricing toward financial infrastructure. In the United States or Europe, a family might sign up online and have monthly fees drawn automatically from a bank account. In poorer regions, many households lack credit cards or stable bank access entirely. To bridge this, SpaceX and local partners have enabled mobile money payments in parts of Africa, letting families use prepaid balances stored in phones. These adjustments are vital, since even when costs are lowered, the means of payment remain a practical barrier. Without localized financial tools, coverage alone does not equal adoption. Regulation and subsidy decisions add further layers. In Europe, questions arise about whether public subsidies should support satellite services when investment in fiber may prove cheaper long-term. Some officials argue subsidies might entrench reliance on foreign-owned infrastructure. In the United States, however, subsidies for rural broadband explicitly include Starlink as eligible providers, lowering costs for participants and giving families smoother pathways past the equipment investment. Similar debates occur in Latin America, where governments weigh whether satellite systems complement or compete with their national infrastructure plans. Public policy, in other words, heavily shapes what affordability looks like in practice. The outcome is a patchwork. In suburbs of wealthy nations, households sometimes treat Starlink as a backup service, spending $100 a month for the comfort of redundancy. In villages in West Africa, the same service level represents a community's pooled funds, accessible only in shared hubs. In post-disaster zones, equipment donated by aid groups grants free access to shelters. And in upper-income aviation markets, premium contracts generate profits far exceeding household rates. One constellation spans them all, yet each experience is defined by local economics. Still, within these uneven conditions, breakthroughs emerge. A rural clinic in Peru's Andes uses a discounted community plan to enable video calls with urban hospitals, cutting travel for patients from days to minutes. In Ukraine, amid rebuilding efforts, donor-funded terminals installed in villages gave children reliable connections to remote classrooms even before school buildings were repaired. Across such cases, the deciding factor is not technology's availability, but the affordability structures built around it. Despite those successes, cost remains the most durable ceiling. Billions of people remain outside the digital sphere, not because satellites cannot cover their rooftops, but because service plans still exceed what their budgets will allow. Technology has eliminated physical barriers to connection. Economic barriers remain the main limiter to universal access. And while prices and subsidies set the terms for who comes online today, the story of Starlink is also influenced by another dimension entirely. The machines in orbit and the ground equipment in homes and schools have changed since the project began, reshaped by constant design upgrades. Understanding what people can afford is only part of the picture. The other part is how the technology itself has evolved, and what those changes mean for the future of satellite networks. Technology in orbit and on the ground. By 2025, the constellation itself looks very different from the early trains of satellites that captured attention back in 2019. The hardware has advanced with each iteration. Inter-satellite laser links now connect satellites directly to one another. V2 mini satellites carry more efficient thrusters and improved solar arrays, and user terminals on the ground have become smaller, lighter, and far less power-hungry. In other words, both orbiting spacecraft and household equipment have been steadily re-engineered, making the system faster, more flexible, and more practical for everyday use. One of the most noticeable breakthroughs is in the lasers linking satellites overhead. The first satellites had no such interconnection. Any signal had to travel from a dish on the ground up to a satellite, straight down to a gateway station, and then back up again to continue its journey. That dependency created inefficiencies and tied service quality to the limited number of ground stations. By contrast, today's inter-satellite lasers allow a message to hop from Alaska to Europe through satellites alone before it ever descends to Earth. The benefit for ordinary users is clear: lower latency, less reliance on local ground infrastructure, and connections that remain resilient even when entire regions lose power. Latency itself was a fundamental weakness of older satellite systems. Gamers, video callers, and emergency responders all felt the delay of earlier generations. But the most recent speed tests demonstrate clear progress. According to Ookla's data, Starlink's median US download speeds roughly doubled between 2022 and early 2025, now averaging about 105 megabits per second. Just as important, latency has dropped near the level of ground-based broadband, enough to make remote meetings or multiplayer gaming genuinely feasible in places that once had no hope of usable service. That shift from good for browsing to usable for real-time applications reflects the cumulative impact of design changes overhead. Another layer of improvement lies in the satellites themselves. The newer V2 mini generation is lighter yet more capable, equipped with advanced processors and improved solar panels that absorb more energy while reflecting less sunlight toward Earth. These refinements extend operating lifespans, enhance overall bandwidth, and reduce the light pollution that drew heavy criticism from astronomers in the early years. Tracking data suggests the newer models hold tighter positions in orbit as well, meaning fewer drift problems and fewer instances that require collision avoidance maneuvers. For science communities, that translates into fewer streaks across telescopes. For users, it means a more stable network capable of carrying heavier loads. Propulsion has also changed the practical way the constellation operates. Older chemical thrusters have gradually given way to efficient ion systems, saving mass and extending control over each satellite's orbit. This efficiency keeps units in service for longer, lowers replacement frequency, and reduces the risk of uncontrolled re-entries. Together, these adjustments make the constellation more sustainable to operate and easier to manage amid crowded orbital paths. While not immune to future risks, the satellites have become more predictable assets, something of particular importance as regulators track orbital congestion more closely. On Earth, the evolution is equally visible. Early Starlink dishes required professional installation, drew substantial power, and cost hundreds of dollars to deploy. Current user terminals are closer in weight to a laptop, operate efficiently on modest solar panels, and adjust automatically without motorized parts. For families, the difference is simple. The dish arrives in a box, can be set up in minutes, and draws little power even during extended operation. For emergency workers, portability means terminals can be tossed into a backpack and carried to disaster areas where communications are otherwise wiped out. This shrinking of ground hardware has quietly expanded Starlink's role in humanitarian response, not only in theory, but in repeated field deployments after storms, wildfires, and earthquakes. Energy use, both in space and on the ground, has steadily dropped across generations. Reduced demands allow wider adoption in off-grid communities. Rural clinics in parts of Latin America, for example, now use Starlink with nothing more than a rooftop solar array and a few batteries, creating viable connections without large diesel generators. Meanwhile, satellites that can maneuver efficiently with minimal fuel extend the life of the network, balancing costs while avoiding unnecessary additions to orbital debris. In both domains, efficiency has reshaped who can realistically operate with satellite internet. Launch strategy has adapted alongside hardware. Early Falcon 9 missions carried about 60 satellites at a time. By 2025, production runs are faster and rockets frequently deploy larger payloads, aided by improvements in reuse and by new heavy lift capability gearing up to expand capacity even further. What once felt like a bottleneck is now an industrial routine, with manufacturing and launches timed in a way that allows whole generations to be refreshed, while obsolete units are guided down and replaced. That iterative turnover creates a constellation that constantly renews itself instead of freezing into the limitations of a single batch. Portability has emerged as a defining feature of this new equipment. User terminals no longer stay fixed to rooftops. They are mounted on trucks delivering supplies through remote terrain, on planes keeping passengers online across oceans, and on ships where reliable coverage once required costly, specialized maritime systems. The fact that Starlink now follows people as they move rather than waiting for them at fixed points has reframed popular understanding of what it means to be online. For many users, coverage no longer ends at the city line, but extends into the desert, mountains, and sea. Resilience has also improved with every iteration. The satellite-to-satellite connections make the system less vulnerable to localized failures, whether technical or political. If ground stations in one region go offline due to disaster or conflict, traffic reroutes overhead until it finds another exit. The same holds true for cyber attacks, where redundancy in routing lets the network bypass compromised points with minimal disruption. This architecture is not invulnerable, but it represents a level of robustness absent from the early years, and it reflects deliberate lessons learned from both technical mishaps and geopolitical crises. All of these changes add up to more than a list of hardware tweaks. They define how usable and sustainable the system has become. A satellite network that once seemed experimental now carries millions of daily users, powers schools and clinics in remote locations, and supports commercial fleets in transit. The technical story is one of iteration, each step small but collectively large enough to change outcomes for those relying on the service. And though Starlink has benefited from a head start, rivals like Kuiper and OneWeb are planning their own advanced constellations, meaning that progress in one system should be viewed as part of an evolving competitive landscape. In this respect, the lesson is balance. Starlink's hardware advances have given it a performance lead in 2025, but competitors are launching next-generation systems as well. The race ahead will be shaped less by a single company's dominance than by whether incremental improvements stay ahead of expanding risks. And that leads directly to another question, one that has less to do with bandwidth speeds and more to do with the sustainability of space itself. The same efficiencies that allow more satellites to orbit for longer also mean that low Earth orbit is becoming more crowded, more active, and potentially more unstable. The tension now lies in where technical achievement meets environmental consequence. Environmental warnings, the space debris question. At the same time that satellites are becoming smarter and more efficient, warnings about the growing risks of orbital debris are gaining urgency. The sheer number of spacecraft now circling the planet has forced governments, scientists, and operators to confront an uncomfortable reality. Low Earth orbit is not limitless. It functions as a shared environment, and its stability depends on keeping an already crowded domain from spiraling into chaos. The scenario that specialists worry about most is called Kessler syndrome, a cascading chain reaction in which one collision produces fragments. Those fragments strike other satellites, and the cycle continues until orbit is littered with debris. A single destroyed satellite can generate thousands of high-velocity shards, each moving fast enough to cripple or destroy another spacecraft. Collisions of this kind are rare, but the math is unforgiving. The denser the region, the greater the chance that even one uncontrolled impact could trigger a sustained crisis. Recent data shows the scale of the problem more clearly than theory alone. Starlink's constellation represents the majority of active satellites in low Earth orbit, which means it is also responsible for most orbital maneuvers designed to prevent accidents. In filings with U.S. regulators, SpaceX disclosed that Starlink performed roughly 50,000 automated avoidance maneuvers between December 1, 2023 and May 31, 2024. That is not a prediction. It is a record of actual corrections over just 6 months, evidence of how frequently satellites must adjust their paths to stay safe. What once seemed like rare exceptions has become standard operating procedure. As of mid-2025, no Starlink satellites are known to have been lost in a confirmed collision, but the sheer volume of near misses reveals how thin the safety margins have become. One widely reported 2024 incident forced several units to shift course when a decades-old rocket stage drifted into a populated orbital shell. Another year, a Starlink satellite and a small imaging spacecraft passed within a fraction of a kilometer of each other, close enough to raise alarm among operators familiar with orbital speeds measured in kilometers per second. None of these moments ended in disaster, but the constant need for adjustment demonstrates that the risk is real and growing. To manage those risks, companies have introduced their own mitigation tools. SpaceX programs each Starlink satellite with an end-of-life plan. Propulsion systems guide the unit back into Earth's atmosphere within a few years of retirement, keeping derelict hardware from drifting indefinitely. On-board thrusters also allow active satellites to perform collision avoidance maneuvers automatically, following probability thresholds built on predictive modeling. Rather than waiting for human controllers to debate which satellite should move, these algorithms decide quickly, minimizing reaction time and reducing the chance of two operators inadvertently making conflicting maneuvers. Engineers have also reduced brightness in newer models, making satellites easier to track through ground-based telescopes that feed orbital databases. When an object is visible and predictable, other spacecraft can avoid it more effectively. Sharing trajectory data has become another method of reassurance. While not all operators disclose full movement records, Starlink has occasionally provided datasets more openly, showing that tighter transparency can reduce uncertainty for all participants. These practices signal acknowledgement that the network's scale brings special responsibility. Still, the larger problem cannot be solved by one company alone. Dozens of nations and multiple private firms now launch satellites into low Earth orbit, and there is no single global authority responsible for traffic management. Operators exchange warnings through voluntary channels, but unlike air travel, there is no binding system that dictates who must alter course or which path has priority. Each potential close pass is negotiated in real time. Governments have proposed new frameworks modeled after aviation or maritime rules, yet consensus has been elusive. Some states fear strict oversight could slow innovation or disadvantage domestic companies. Others warn that leaving coordination voluntary risks losing access to orbital territory altogether if a chain reaction took place. The environmental side extends down into Earth's atmosphere as well. Satellite deorbiting leads to hardware burning up on re-entry, scattering vaporized materials into the upper layers of air. Scientists continue to examine whether the long-term accumulation of these byproducts could affect atmospheric processes. Answers are incomplete, but the very need for such studies shows how orbital expansion has blurred the line between space activity and Earth's environment. What happens overhead may not remain insulated from the climate systems below. Policy debates have grown louder as collisions come closer. Astronomers argue that orbital congestion not only threatens satellites, but also interferes with observations of the night sky. Communications experts suggest that losing parts of low Earth orbit to debris would compromise global broadband, weather forecasting, and Earth observation satellites. Governments have begun to push for stricter standards, such as shortening maximum orbital lifetimes for defunct satellites and mandating better tracking disclosure. The tension is between voluntary best practices, with operators pledging self-restraint, and binding regulations that could apply uniformly across countries and companies. Other operators face similar scrutiny. OneWeb, Kuiper, and smaller regional projects add to the density, all contributing to the same zone of risk regardless of scale. Each new layer of hardware requires careful coordination with the satellites already aloft. The aggregate effect transforms orbit into what some researchers call a congested commons, a domain where the actions of one player affect everyone else. If even one actor ignores mitigation protocols, the entire network of satellites could be endangered. For now, the strategy is incremental. Rely on automation, push satellites to exit safely at end of life and maintain constant coordination. But critics point out that these are stopgaps, not permanent solutions. Every year adds thousands of new satellites, multiplying complexity. Even with today's best avoidance algorithms, the system becomes harder to manage as density rises. The worry is not simply today's maneuvers, but tomorrow's tipping points, when the pace of deployment surpasses what software and coordination can handle. The real burden is sharing responsibility across borders. No single government controls low Earth orbit, and international bodies like the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space are still debating how far their authority should extend. That gap leaves operators navigating gray zones where safety depends on cooperation rather than enforcement. The recent record of 50,000 maneuvers in 6 months is proof that stress is building faster than policy can adapt. What this means for the immediate future is straightforward. Starlink and its peers have shown that operational safeguards can delay the crisis, but they cannot eliminate it. The orbital environment is visibly under pressure, and every close call is a reminder of how fragile it has become. Debate now centers not just on who benefits from global satellite internet, but also on who should bear responsibility if something goes wrong. The environment is shared. The consequences will be too. The unresolved question is whether international structures strong enough to manage orbital traffic will actually materialize before a major collision forces the issue. Until then, satellites continue their silent orbits, maneuvering thousands of times a month to keep fragments and functioning spacecraft apart. That balancing act makes the sustainability of space uncertain. And uncertainty in the environment is only one layer of vulnerability that comes with a system this vast. Another layer involves the risks that no debris field can cause, the invisible kind of threat that targets the system itself. Battling hackers and the cyber frontier. Cybersecurity has now emerged as one of the most pressing dimensions of satellite connectivity. If threats to orbital safety are measured in collisions, then threats to communication security are measured in jamming, probing, and hacking attempts that unfold quietly but carry equally wide consequences. Starlink's role as a growing backbone for global internet access means interference no longer affects just entertainment traffic, but also emergency coordination, military communication, and even the functioning of national systems. Safeguarding this architecture has become as foundational as launching the satellites themselves. The risks are varied but familiar to those watching digital conflict. In several regions under political crisis or outright war, documented jamming attempts sought to drown out Starlink terminals with radio noise. Portable emitters used in conflict zones disrupted connections for short bursts, proof that even relatively low-cost devices can cause disruptions on a billion-dollar network. Researchers also confirmed denial-of-service probes, which flooded connections at gateways in late 2024, aiming to overwhelm servers with noise. Beyond these blunt force tactics, adversaries targeted more subtle avenues, monitoring for weak points in firmware update cycles, probing for the chance to substitute corrupted code or tamper with supply chains. In each case, the intent was clear: turn the resilience of a global internet backbone into a vulnerability. Defenses respond point for point to those threats. Encryption now layers every phase of a Starlink connection, with rotating keys that make interception impractical. Multi-layer protocols ensure that even if one barrier falls, additional ones remain. Satellites have evolved beamforming capability, creating narrow transmissions shaped directly toward user terminals rather than broadcasting broadly. Paired with frequency hopping, this sharply reduces the window for successful jamming, keeping signals locked even when adversaries attempt saturation. Terminal updates follow cryptographic validation routines, meaning code that does not carry the proper signature is rejected before it can run. Each device also carries intrusion detection tools that monitor unusual patterns and suspend suspect activity the moment anomalies appear. Instead of relying on a single defensive gate, the system distributes its protections across thousands of stations and satellites, strengthening the constellation against multiple types of assault. Operational practice turns these measures from theory into defense in depth. Starlink maintains monitoring teams whose sole task is watching global feeds for irregular activity. Detection is increasingly powered by artificial intelligence trained to distinguish genuine attacks from ordinary traffic. This automation allows immediate countermeasures in seconds rather than minutes or hours. The architecture itself adds another form of protection: redundancy. If one pathway is blocked, traffic reroutes almost instantly through thousands of other satellites. Disruption at a single gateway does not collapse the system, because the network is structured to balance flow across many nodes at once. The design favors resilience, though never permanence. No system is invulnerable. Resilience is an ongoing race against evolving threats. For governments, the stakes are understood in stark terms. During active conflict, hackers and state actors aim not simply to disrupt streaming, but to sever command networks or undermine confidence in communication during emergencies. For protesters relying on satellite links under censorship, distrust in a connection's safety could silence voices before they are heard. These realities explain why engineers emphasize that cybersecurity is more than technical tuning. It is the condition for credibility. Without it, adoption in fragile contexts would collapse, eroding the very premise of global access. The balance is therefore one of constant tension. Attackers adapt methods, shifting between jamming, denial of service, and probing of endpoints. Defenders counter with updated protocols, directional signaling, stricter update cycles, and automated monitoring. Each round makes large-scale disruption more difficult, but none provides final victory. The contest remains open-ended, a perpetual measure of adaptation where every improvement invites the next challenge. This shifting frontier reinforces how cyber protection now sits alongside propulsion or orbital management as a core function of constellation operation. Starlink is no longer judged solely on speed or accessibility, but also on whether it can withstand the inevitability of targeted attacks. That resilience must be sustained so long as satellites orbit above contested regions, and so long as communities treat the dishes in front of their homes as the only open line to the outside world. It is in those households, towns, and schools where these high-level defenses take shape in practical reality. Users rarely see encryption keys or anomaly detection systems, but they live the results. Signals that remain stable despite national shutdowns, terminals that keep working as disasters unfold, connections that feel reliable even amid constant interference attempts. To understand what this struggle over cybersecurity means, it is necessary to see where the system actually reaches those who depend on it most. The next part of the story shifts from system-level defense to the human scale, where its effects are measured one family, one school, and one emergency response at a time. Stories from the ground. When threats to cybersecurity seem abstract or distant, it helps to remember that this network is lived every day at ground level. Behind every discussion of satellites or maneuvers, there are ordinary families, classrooms, and workers for whom a connection means something simple but profound. This is where the story shifts, away from orbital mechanics or hacker probes, down to the people whose routines are reshaped when a dish finds a signal from above. For teachers, the difference shows up in minutes saved and classes transformed. On the Navajo Nation, schools that once had to bus students to the nearest town for reliable internet now teach online lessons daily with Starlink terminals on their rooftops. In Oregon's Vernonia School District, where storm damage had left connectivity unreliable for years, classrooms shifted from 2 or 3 shared stations to full coverage that supports every student. Parents saw attendance rise, and standardized test scores improved once lessons no longer stalled on broken dial-up systems. These cases stand out because the result is measurable: more completed assignments, higher participation, and lower dropout rates. Farmers noticed the impact in yields and incomes. One cooperative in rural Kenya, after placing a community terminal in its main office, began checking updated crop prices daily before shipping produce to nearby cities. Instead of relying on middlemen, they sold directly, keeping profit margins that had previously leaked away. Connected weather forecasts and sensor data also let them adjust irrigation schedules, cutting losses during irregular rainfall. The practical outcome is visible in household spending, with families purchasing better equipment and supporting children in school, all tied to simple access that would not exist without satellite internet. Remote work tells another story. A young developer in the Philippines had long considered leaving for the city, since projects requiring reliable video calls were impossible in his coastal town. Once Starlink arrived, he began working directly for overseas clients, keeping income local instead of sending remittances back from afar. A teacher in rural Chile conducted online tutoring sessions in English while raising her children at home, something previously impossible without moving hundreds of miles away. Work once confined to urban centers now circulates into villages, altering migration patterns one paycheck at a time. Emergency responders measure value in moments. After wildfires in Greece in 2024 destroyed cell towers, fire crews deployed portable Starlink terminals in trucks to transmit maps to command centers. In the Philippines, during typhoon evacuations, relief workers maintained active communication with remote shelters while ordinary telecom lines were still down. These terminals proved life-saving. Casualty numbers dropped compared to past disasters, and coordination sped up because communication was immediate. The result is not abstract. Faster evacuation routes, quicker arrival of supplies, and shortened downtime for communities facing trauma. Healthcare adds another scene. In a highland Peruvian clinic, a nurse who once depended on rare monthly visits from traveling specialists can now video call doctors in Lima in real time. Patient records transmit electronically, removing delays that meant lost opportunities for treatment. Survival rates for certain conditions improved once diagnoses happened within days, not months. In parts of Alaska, small towns have used portable terminals to connect directly with regional hospitals during emergencies, supporting telemedicine in regions where helicopters are often grounded by weather. Here, the chain between satellite and survival is direct and personal. Families speak in terms of presence. Migrant workers in Europe now appear on screens nightly in their living rooms back home in Africa or Asia, instead of relying on costly international phone cards once a month. Birthdays, weddings, and funerals unfold live, shrinking the distance between families scattered by economic necessity. For younger generations, the change is cultural as much as technical. Students in small towns binge the same content as peers in cities, building shared experiences across distance. Parents struggle with new risks, exposure to outside influences, online scams, but agree that isolation no longer defines their children's world. In many villages, access is still collective, with one terminal set up in a shared space. In northern Tanzania, households purchase vouchers for hourly Wi-Fi use, much like prepaid mobile credit once spread across the continent. Children converge at the hub in the evenings with borrowed phones to complete assignments, while parents check weather or market news. Small kiosks selling minutes of internet sprout around terminals, creating new micro-businesses. Although speeds are shared and personal access remains limited, the effect is a leap compared to prior offline conditions. The payoff is simple: homework completed on time, communication with distant relatives, and economic exchanges that were impossible before. These gains are convincing but not universal. They often occur in places where donors provided the terminal, government subsidized installations, or households could afford the cost. Entire regions still remain offline where pricing or regulation blocks adoption. The stories showcase what happens when barriers are lowered, but they also highlight the unevenness of distribution across the global map. Recognition of that gap is essential for an honest account of how this technology shapes lives. At the same time, ripple effects radiate once adoption begins. A single school connecting successfully often encourages others in the district to pool resources. One family's terminal in a rural town spurs neighbors to invest jointly, confident after witnessing clear benefit. That repeatable pattern, visible success leading to wider uptake, explains why adoption spreads faster once a foothold is made. Community momentum frequently turns isolated wins into regional change, multiplying benefits long after the first dish was installed. All of these stories compress satellite technology into human experience. The numbers may report thousands of satellites and millions of subscribers, but the significance at ground level is specific. A student watching a lesson she once missed, a farmer setting a fairer price for grain, a patient receiving treatment sooner, a family reuniting across borders, a rescue team shaving minutes from their response. These payoffs may not carry headlines about orbital mechanics or corporate revenue, but they represent the actual meaning of connection for those who live it. The broader measure is how entire communities perceive themselves once connected. Villages once peripheral to national life begin to participate in digital governance, from accessing records online to attending virtual training sessions. Small towns organize competitions, religious events, or trade fairs over shared platforms rather than traveling for days. Little by little, integration with national economies and institutions follows the arrival of a reliable signal. The effect is steady, observable, and extends far beyond individual anecdotes. Taken together, these vignettes reveal a shift in what satellite networks mean in practice. They are not just systems of hardware in orbit, but instruments shaping education, medicine, family life, and resilience in crisis. The uneven geography of access remains undeniable, but where connection has landed, lives have been altered in tangible ways. It is here, in classrooms, clinics, farms, and homes, that the weight of global infrastructure finds its meaning. And from these ground-level stories arises a wider question. If one constellation can influence daily life at this scale, what does that say about its role in the broader structure of society? That point brings us back from the level of the individual to begin considering the larger frame in which these systems now operate. Starlink is no longer an experiment in orbit. It has become part of the world's communications backbone. Satellites now serve a role once held only by undersea cables and mobile towers, carrying voices, data, and decisions across borders. But unlike those older systems, this network is managed by one private company, with authority concentrated in a way that shapes communication, science, and politics all at once. The dual reality is plain. Starlink delivers enormous benefits while concentrating power in unprecedented ways. It is here to stay, and whether its presence deepens divides or broadens opportunity depends on how governments, regulators, and communities respond. Will this make the world fairer, or simply shift old inequalities into orbit? Which local story surprised you most? The school, the clinic, or the disaster response? Tell us in the comments.